안녕하십니까. 저는 시도시사협의회 미국 사무소 이경호입니다. 대한민국 시도시사협의회와 주 뉴욕 총영사관이 공동 주최하는 코비드-19와 미국 지방정부의 대정위기 대응 온라인 포럼에 참석해주신 전국
I would like to thank you, everyone, especially the officials from local governments and our speakers for joining this webinar. We will listen to the opening remarks, congratulatory remarks, followed by 3 different presentations. The opening remarks will be given in Korean, and for smooth proceeding, we will provide simultaneous interpretation, and you can listen to interpretation from YouTube Live as well. We will now begin with the official event. First, we will listen to Secretary General Chun Sung-hwan of KAO for his opening speech.
안녕하십니까. 대한민국 시도지사협의회 전성환
I'm Sung-hwan
사무총장입니다.
Chun, the Secretary General of the
바쁘신
Governance
중에도
Association of Korea,
코비드19와
or
미국
KAO.
지방정부의
I'd like
재정위기
to
대응
thank you for
온라인
joining
포럼에
the forum on the
발표를 위해서
financial
참석해 주신
challenges of the state and local
캐서린
governments in
윌로비
the
교수님,
U.S. amid the global
데보라
pandemic,
캐롤
especially
교수님,
Professor
셀비
Katherine
컨즈
Willoughby,
국장님
Professor
감사합니다.
Deborah Carroll, and Executive Director
그리고
Shelby
이른
Kerns.
아침부터 온라인으로 참여하고 계신
Let me
한국
also thank
지방정부
officials
관계자
from
여러분에게
Korea's local governments
진심으로
joining us
감사를
online
드립니다.
from early morning.
지난 1년이 넘는 시간 동안
For more than a year,
인류는
the
코비드19
humankind has been
팬데믹
striving
사태라는
to
이제껏
fight
경험하지
and
못한
overcome
미정유의 터널을
COVID-19,
지나고 있습니다.
going through an
이러한
unforeseen
위기
challenge.
속에서 가장 일선에서
this
국민들과 함께
Unprecedented
어려움을 이겨내고
crisis of the
해결해온 것은
pandemic, it's been the local
지방정부였습니다.
governments that responded to and
그리고
overcame
시도지사협의회는
difficulties with the people.
지방정부의 든든한
And
동반자,
KAO, as the staunch
지지자로서
partner and
최선을
supporter of
다해
local
한국
governments, has been
지방자치의
striving to
발전을 위해
achieve development
노력해오고
of local
있습니다.
governance in Korea.
그 일환으로
As part of
대한민국
this effort, KAO
시도지사협의회는
plans to regularly hold
지방자치단체가
webinars on
직면하고
issues
있는
faced by
문제
local
해결과
governments and that
포스트
need to
코로나
be
사회에
understood to
대비하기 위한
respond to social
사회적,
challenges
정책적 도움을 되고자
by sharing
주요
key
해외 사례를
overseas
살펴보는
examples.
온라인 포럼을 지속적으로 개최할
And we are
계획입니다.
going to continuously hold
그 첫
these kind of
번째로
events going
오늘
forward.
미국의
And
지방정부가
today will be
겪고
the
있는
first of these
재정 불균형,
series,
재정
which is
위기와
focused on
그
the
해결을
fiscal
위한
imbalance
논의들을
crisis and
살펴보고자 합니다.
responses of local governments in
한국의
the
지방정부와
U.S.
마찬가지로
Just
미국
like in
지방정부도
Korea, U.S. local
코비드19
governments and state
확산
governments
방지를
are
위한
focused on the
방역
two
정책과
tasks of controlling
지역 경제
COVID-19
활성화라는
and
두 가지
revitalizing
핵심
the
가지에
local
집중하고
economy.
있습니다. 공공지출은 확대되었고 경기 위축으로 지방 세수는
Public
감소하는 등
expenditure has been
미국 내
increasing,
지역
but
경제는
revenue has been
이중고를
decreasing.
겪고 있습니다.
So the
또한
U.S.
포스트
local
코로나
governments are
19의
faced with a
시대에
double whammy
발맞춘
challenge.
경제 성장 동력 확보를 위해
In order
중장기의
to
대규모
secure
인프라
new
구축
growth
사업도
engines,
계획하고
the U.S. has
발표하고
been
있습니다.
planning large-scale
전례 없는
infrastructure
위기 극복을
projects.
위해 최선을 다하는 동시에 미래를 위한 투자를
While working
시행함에
hard to
있어
overcome this
필수적으로
unprecedented
동반되는 것은
crisis and
재원의
to
조달
make
가능성과
investments for the future,
지방재정
we
안정성이라는
need to
화두일 것입니다.
focus our attention on
유사한 상황에
securing
직면한
stability
한국의
in revenue
지방정부에게도
streams.
미국 지방정부의 재정에 대한 고민과 노력은 좋은 참고
The U.S.
자료가 될
case in terms
것이라고
of fiscal
믿습니다.
management will be of
두
great
시간이라는
reference to
짧은
Korean local
시간이지만
governments.
참석하신
It's
모든
a short
분들에게
2-hour
미국
webinar that I
지방정부의
hope that
재정위기
becomes a
상황과
very
이를 해결하기 위한 노력에 대해
helpful
충분히
event
이해하고
for you to
나아가 각
understand the
지방정부의
fiscal
재정을
crisis and
통한
responses
코로나
of
이후
U.S.
회복력을
local
넣는
governments and
정책적
contributes to
시사점을 넣는
fiscal
계기가 되기를
operations in the
바랍니다.
future.
감사합니다.
Thank you very much.
감사합니다.
Thank you. Next, we are going to hear from Ambassador Won Sam-jang for his congratulatory addresses. First of all, when international exchanges are difficult due to global pandemic, it's really meaningful to continue the ground of exchange to share similar difficulties facing both countries online and contemplating on solutions. Secretary General Sung-hwan Chun of KAO, thank you for organizing this wonderful event. And it's late, but those who are participating from the US for the presentation, Professor Katherine Willoughby, Professor Deborah Carroll, and Director Shelby Kerns, my thanks also goes to you. The United States is one of the countries most affected by COVID-19. At the same time, however, it is one of the countries that has advanced in preparation for the post-corona era. For example, the Biden administration is implementing a plan to complete the vaccination within the first half of this year. On this premises, we're spurring the preparation efforts for economic resumption. Meanwhile, the largest public finance investment plans in history were announced one after another. The US is expressing its will to lead the post-corona era through investments in somewhat neglected areas of climate change, public infrastructure, and future industries. Local governments in the United States are also preparing very site-specific policies in line with the federal government policies. The conditions for the success of these ambitious initiatives are the close cooperation between the federal and local governments and solid finance. Korea is also a leading country in response to COVID-19 and preparation for the post-COVID-19 era. Therefore, it is meaningful and timely to look at the case of preparation and response in the United States. And I think today's event is even more meaningful as the US and Korea are taking steps toward global issues such as economy and security. I hope that today's forum will be of great help to all of you who are preparing for the future of Korea. And I hope that such exchanges between the US and Korea will continue to be active in the future. Thank you.
감사합니다. 이제
Thank you.
지방정부의 재정 위기와 대응에 대해 들어보도록 하겠습니다.
Now we are going to hear from the US speakers. That will start a full-fledged event from now on. Jung Gon-an, Consul at the Consulate General of New York, will moderate the event.
Good morning and good evening, everyone. My name is Jung Gon-an. I'm Consul at Consulate General of the Republic of Korea in New York, and also Director of the America Branch of the Governors Association of Korea. Today, we are going to discuss the financial challenges facing state and local governments in the US while coping with the COVID-19 pandemic. Over the past year, many governments worldwide have made great efforts to protect their people and prevent the collapse of their economy. The state and local government in the US have played a critical role in responding to COVID-19 by purchasing PPE and medical equipment, implementing measures to reduce unemployment, and vaccinating citizens more effectively. Korean local governments and most local governments worldwide have played a similar role during the global pandemic. Now that vaccines are available and the businesses are opening up, we are looking forward to moving to a new normal. But there are concerns about state and local governments' fiscal health in the process of responding to COVID-19. As for the US state and local government's finances, some say that COVID-19 affects the nation's financial health in the long run. Demand for social safety nets, such as unemployment benefits and health insurance programs for low-income families, is so high that it will negatively impact the economy. On the other hand, there is a view that the state and local governments' financial health will remain strong from substantial support from the federal government. Today, we will take a look at this topic from various perspectives and study a comprehensive approach to this issue. It may be complicated topics to discuss, but luckily, we invited three of the most distinguished experts in the United States who have been working in this field for a long time. Before listening to the speakers, I will give you the basic information of US states and the Korean metropolitan and municipal governments' financial structures through 2 slides. It will provide you with some background information before we get into the presentations. In the first slide, let me tell you the basic structure of expenditure by funding source and function in the United States. As you know, there are 50 state governments and 5 territories in the United States. This chart shows an average number. The amount of budget for all states is about 2.2 trillion US dollars. 40% of all states' spending comes from the general fund, which is the largest fund for financing state operations. In this category, the sources are personal income tax, sales tax, corporate income tax, gaming tax, and other taxes and fees. About 26% comes from other states' funds, like fees and the gas tax, and around 2% comes from bonds. The remaining 32% of state expenditures comes from the federal government. On the right side, a donut chart shows the breakdown of what the states spend money on. You can see Medicaid programs, K-12, higher education, and transportation have taken quite a significant portion. The second slide is about the basic financial structure in Korea. There are 17 metropolitan cities and provinces in Korea. The nature of these 17 entities is somewhat similar to state government characteristics, but also resembles some of the local government character in the US. The chart shows the average expenditures of 17 entities. Even though it is difficult to compare it directly to states' data, it will give you a rough idea of Korea's fiscal structure. The amount of budget for all entities is about 330 billion US dollars total. 24% comes from local tax, 7.4% comes from non-tax revenue, such as fees. 15% comes from local share tax, and around 1% comes from bonds. The remaining 34% of expenditure comes from the central government. The chart on the right shows the breakdown of metropolitan cities and provinces spending. You can see social welfare, environmental protection, general public service, and transportation have taken quite a big portion. Before we hear the speaker's presentation, I would like to ask all participants to keep in mind that today's webinar will cover general aspects of 50 states in the United States. Please take into account that the United States is decentralized and every state is different. For example, 5 states in the US don't have any sales tax at all, unlike other 45 states. Now, we are going to have 3 speakers to present today. Our first speaker is Katherine Willoughby. She is the Golombiewski Professor of Public Administration at the University of Georgia in the School of Public and International Affairs, Department of Public Administration and Policy. She has spent over 30 years in this field, and she is an internationally recognized expert of the legal foundations, use and effects of performance budgeting on US state finances, state management, budget, and finances. Her current research about local government fiscal resiliency in the time of COVID-19 is recently published in journals, research reports, and new articles, blogs, and presented in several podcasts. The title of her presentation today is State Finances and Readiness, the Great Recession and COVID-19. Katherine Willoughby, are you ready? Please.
I am, thank you. Thank you so much for having me, and I really appreciate being a part of this important webinar. My presentation today is U.S. State Finances and Readiness, and I'm going to be comparing the Great Recession, state finances coming upon the Great Recession, and then again looking at it coming up on COVID. So let's see if we can. So as noted, you know, United States is somewhat unique. The states created the federal government, and the states are sovereign in and of themselves. So we've got 50 state systems that are quite distinctive. And state finances are a function of all of these things. Perhaps the most important, of course, is state constitutions and laws that prescribe state taxing and spending abilities and capacities. An important component of all but one state is the legal requirement for a balanced budget. And of course, the US federal government does not have a balanced budget requirement. So that's an important constraint on states, different from the federal government, that needs to be recognized. And all states have different kinds of constraints. So that balanced budget requirement may look different. It may mean that the general fund must be balanced, that the governor presents a balanced budget, that the legislature passes a balanced budget, or that the budget or the general fund is balanced at the end of the year. So there may be a lot of different, there's a range in the constraint of these laws. State economies and the industries in these states obviously impact state finances, as does demographics. The tax structure, as noted earlier, tax structures across the states are quite different. States generally take advantage of a personal income tax and a sales tax, a general sales tax, among others, but states differ in how they develop these structures and how diversified their structures are. The budget process is different in the states. You've got states that may have a strong governor compared to the legislature, such as in Tennessee, or you might have a state with a very strong legislature where the budget is predominantly created by the legislature, with a relatively weak governor like in Texas. And then you've got some balance, for instance, in the state of Georgia, where you have a fairly strong governor and with strong budget powers in setting the revenue estimate, for instance, against a legislature that is quite strong. State organization and capacity, how many elected officials head up agencies, for instance, and integration of IT within each of the agencies. All of these affect state finances. Obviously, political culture and current party balance will impact state finances given agendas of the various parties, and we do have quite a divide in the United States today. Regional economies impact state finances, as does the national economy. And today we know that natural disasters are certainly impacting state finances. Man-made disasters, such as mass shootings, for instance, ransomware attacks, these sorts of things and accidents like chemical spills. So all of these kinds of disasters impact state finances. And most governments, as we know today, are dealing with probably disasters of many different types at the same time or consecutively. So this is a problem. As I noted, important points to keep in mind: U.S. state governments operate independently of one another and from the federal government. Circumstances leading to the Great Recession were different than those leading up to the pandemic, and we'll talk a little bit about those. And then federal leadership and aid to the states during the Great Recession and the pandemic are highly distinctive and impact states as well. So states do a number of things, and you saw the different kinds of functions. They have multiple public service functions, including healthcare and education, each which make up about 28% of state budgets, public safety, transportation, but they're also involved in housing, natural resources, corrections, and a number of other different kinds of services. They account for 9% of the nation's GDP, a share that has steadily increased since the 1950s. Taxes are the largest source of state revenues, and it is true that on average, the federal government funding amounts to about 30% of a state budget. However, that varies widely across the states. You might have a state where that value is 18% or 16%, and you might have a state where it's more like 42 or even 45%. So it's different across the states related to all those different matters that we just discussed earlier. And the taxes, it's important to note for this discussion that state revenues experienced annual growth from 2010 to 2020. So for the last decade, state revenues have experienced growth. Now, we do know, of course, the growth in revenues reversed in early 2020, given COVID, and as states shifted tax filing dates and collection deadlines as the federal government did. And Shelby Kerns will be talking to you a little bit later about the types of things that states did to combat COVID and to combat this reverse in growth of tax revenues. Yet, in this case, demand for state services increased with COVID-19, and particularly unemployment funds were rapidly depleted in the states as job losses exploded. This unemployment rate then and now is really important to look at because it illustrates the vast difference between the two disasters. If we look at the beginning of the disaster, the economic downturn, the Great Recession, here in 2008, we see that, unemployment rate does make rise. It is increasing, but it increases over 2 years before it peaks. And it dips slightly and then peaks again. And then it begins a trajectory downward for the next 10 years. And we see it's actually at its lowest point by January 2020, the unemployment rate. And you see this phenomenal explosive jump in 2020 in the first by March, where it jumps up to almost 15%. So this aspect here is extremely important to understand this distinction in state, understanding state finances before the Great Recession and before COVID exploded. It's important to look at that and see the very low unemployment rate in 2020 and to understand that just prior to 2008, of course, we had a downturn. We had a downturn in 2001 to 2000 and a little dip here, And then so we're in somewhat of a weakened position going into the Great Recession, different from going into COVID. Okay, during the Great Recession, actually we didn't see dramatic dips until the latter part of 2008. We saw, in fact, increases to state tax revenues in the fourth quarter of 2007, which was the official start of the Great Recession. We saw kind of a sunny peak in revenues the second quarter of 2008. And then we do see the downturns of state tax revenues in the third and fourth quarters of 2008, with the trough being reached in the first quarter of 2009. And then by the second quarter, though, of 2009, we start seeing an uptick in aggregate state tax revenues. And not every state realized consistent declines in their tax revenues. In fact, the tax collections in 5 states increased during the recession, particularly in Wyoming, North Dakota, Oregon, Iowa, and South Dakota. Much of the enhancements in Wyoming and North Dakota, for instance, were related to severance taxes. So again, we see this very distinctive activity going on across the states, where it's very difficult to make a overarching statement of what happened in particular amongst the states. Now, during the Great Recession, governors weigh in with their state of state addresses, and this is important because they give a flavor of where they're going, what they expect, where they're going, and prepping their public to understand what they're going to have to deal with. Scholars point out, though, that before the recession, there were real concerns about the adequacy of state fiscal capacity. There were increasing policy responsibilities related to health and jobs, as well as warnings about state long-term challenges, particularly related to pensions and long-term liabilities. And we had experienced the previous mini recession in 2001 to 2002-03, and so we were a little bit weighed down by that. So in their state addresses this year in 2008, governors do express concern about maintaining that budgetary structural balance, which is a legal requirement in the states. More than half of governors discuss plans for replenishing their rainy day funds, or reaching structural balance, or creating a rainy day fund, just creating a rainy day fund. Many emphasize the problems of spending beyond means, the perfect budget storm, of course, using savings to pay bills. These are bad habits, and ongoing debilitating, quote, binge and purge budget processes. In previous times, particularly the 1990s, when revenues were fairly plentiful, many states made pension commitments that then have difficulty being met when we get a downturn, for instance. And then by the time governors were giving their 2009 addresses, the recession was in full swing, of course, and many significant budget gaps began to come forth and be seen in state budgets. So during COVID-19, though, what's the story compared to the recession and revenues? What does it look like? Well, real GDP was pretty sunny. Remember, every quarter, in January 2020, from the second quarter 2009 to the fourth quarter 2019, states experienced growth and real GDP increased, except for 2 quarters, the first quarter in 2011 and the first quarter in 2014. A dip in the first quarter of 2020 of 1.3%, then gave way to a dive of 31.7% in the second quarter, but a tremendous rebound in the third quarter of 2020 of 33.4%, and uptick in the fourth quarter by 4.1%. In spite of the fact of this great rebound, states in 2020 were doing slightly less well in terms of their rebound than they had from 18 to 19. Okay, so diversity of impact equals the diversity of states. So first quarter 2020 state GDP declines in a range from 12 to 1%, but we see differences like Louisiana, Delaware, and Wyoming have declines greater than 10%, while Idaho, North Dakota, and Colorado decline less than 2%. In the second quarter, we see dramatic declines that range from 42% to 22%. Hawaii, Nevada, and Tennessee have declines of greater than 40%, while Utah and Delaware decline less than 25%. Now, states like Hawaii and Nevada are interesting because states highly dependent on entertainment, accommodations, restaurants, hotels, motels, and so these were the types of industry that really got hit with COVID. A lot of low-paying jobs and a lot of jobless. Hawaii experienced more severe ups and downs, probably because it's also highly dependent on tourists getting to the islands by airplane. And with the shutdown of air travel, that dramatically impacted Hawaii's ability to come back from pretty stressful COVID impacts. So during the pandemic, 17 states experienced double-digit GDP declines, while the Great Recession, just 2 states experienced such declines. But remember, during the pandemic, states might experience these declines and then very quickly rebound from those. So, but still a real distinction in what happened here, given the biological disaster that then impacted the economic downturn of COVID compared to the Great Recession, which was an economic downturn with no biological impacts. So what were governors saying in 2020 that might be the same or different from 2008? States, remember, actually enter 2020 with tax revenues that have collectively recovered. In fact, 19% greater than the peak reached right before the recession, the Great Recession. State general fund spending in real dollars returns to Great Recession levels, though 24 states were expecting to spend less from their general funds in 2020 than they did in 2008. But shares of spending shares by function in the states remains fairly stable since the Great Recession, though education and Medicaid become more equal in their makeup of state budgets. Education used to be about half of state budgets back in the day, but now Medicaid health care expenditures have been pushing on that for certainly the last 10 years. In the 2020 State of State addresses, governors were actually highly optimistic. As opposed to being highly concerned, they were highly optimistic given the decade of revenue gains. Many governors said, our state is in excellent shape, we're even thriving. And they talked about improving revenues, their economies, stellar credit ratings. You should know that the credit ratings, is a good thing to look at regarding state finances. And it's interesting over the last decade that probably what we can say is poor states, poorly managed states did worse, and well-managed states are doing better. In fact, in 2008, 11 states had the AAA credit rating, and as of today, 15 states have the AAA credit rating, which is pretty phenomenal. On the other hand, states like New Jersey and Illinois, for instance, that had AA ratings in 2008 now have BBB ratings in 2021. So it's sort of very hard to dig yourself out of poor fiscal management. On the other hand, I think governors learned by 2020 from the Great Recession, and many were hesitant to start making big, expansive promises for changing state budgets and expanding state budgets. Many call for a long-term perspective on the part of the public, and many push for greater fiscal responsibility, bringing down debt, erasing deficits, and limiting future spending. So there's optimism, there's understanding we're doing better, but there's caution in taking that good fortune and expanding as has been done in the past. And this state rainy day funds, it's great to look at this chart because it shows you how much better states are doing at prepping for bad times. We see during 2008, around here, we see that we're about at 4.5% rainy day fund balances as a percent of general fund expenditures. And we take that dip, it takes us a while, you know, to 2 years, the effects of the general recession, and then we start the slow climb up, and we see here that we're at an all-time high by 2020 of about 8%, almost double balances as a percent of general fund expenditures, to the point where the median balance would support a state for about almost a month, which is pretty amazing. And you know, the mean is some of these states that are outliers that have very high balances from their oil and severance funding. So we see that is the difference there. If you take out Alaska and Wyoming and some of these other states, you get down to the median. So this is indicative of the fact that states learned from the Great Recession. Okay, distinctive disasters. So coming in to the end here, what did we learn from this, looking at finances and state fiscal shape before the Great Recession and before COVID? In the Great Recession, remember, there was a previous recessionary period that was weakening to the states. The timing with state budget making was a slow, trek over, really over 2 years. So it was different from COVID that was an instantaneous impact on budgets. And states were in the early, many states were in the legislatures were in session. They might have had to cancel sessions. States ended up changing their fiscal years, or certainly changing tax deadlines and things like that. So the timing with COVID was different in how it affected the states than during the Great Recession. The slow increase in unemployment over 2 years provided states with a little bit of an avenue to deal with unemployment as it grew. The explosive increase in unemployment during COVID-19 was something that really, you know, took states by surprise. As I noted earlier, the economic disaster of the Great Recession was just that, whereas COVID was a biological natural disaster. that spurred economic disaster. And so this made it more complicated. Federal aid came later to the states with the Great Recession. Federal aid was immediate with COVID-19, but it was very distinctive. Whereas the aid during the Great Recession was to help states balance their budgets. The aid, except for the most recent package in the Biden administration, was predominantly for vaccine supplies, vaccine development, to businesses and paycheck protection, to families and individuals, and it was not to states to balance their budget. I will say too that the Great Recession had stronger leadership at the federal level that came down with some coordination, but initially the federal leadership during COVID was, I would say, mixed at best, and this left the states to conduct what we would term a cornucopia of strategies and a patchwork system before we got to the new administration that had a plan, a strategic plan. So thank you for letting me present, and I look forward to your questions.
All right. Thank you, Katherine, Willoughby. You did a great job. I know you can answer all my questions. It's hard to choose just one. Here is a question for you. You emphasized the importance of the fiscal resiliency of state government. What do you think is the reason for states' fiscal resilience? Is it because of the system's completeness or governors who pursue the government's fiscal soundness? I understand that it will depend on the party that governors belong to, but I want to hear your general opinion.
Well, number one, I would say that the requirement that states balance their budget in some way is at the very least, it's symbolic, and it has everybody thinking about the same thing. So that's an important requirement for states. I would also say that states that are most resilient are those, as I noted, that have been conducting fiscal discipline for many, many years. And I'll give you an example. In the state of Georgia, we have a culture of being fiscally conservative. And most governors over the last, I would say over the last 50 years, have always mentioned Georgia's triple A credit rating. And they have that as a chief focus of where they want to go and where they want to be. So having that as a focus of, I would say, the community of the whole. If the public understands how important that is for being able to borrow money at low interest rates, if state employees understand that the more that they can work in a fiscally conservative environment, the more they may be able to do in the future. So having a focus, having that discipline, a community of the whole approach, and having an understanding, governments and particularly governors and legislators have to have a complete understanding of their government systems. And by that I mean, for instance, departments of labor across the nation, state departments of labor, had to initiate tremendous unemployment benefits to their public, to the unemployed. And many states had big problems doing this because they have antiquated systems. Georgia is one of them. And so having an understanding of, you know, the capacity of your systems and being able to anticipate what you're going to have to deal with in the future can help with fiscal resiliency as well.
All right. Yeah, understanding is very important. After understanding something, we can make consensus. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Katherine Willoughby. Now, let's invite today's second speaker. Our second speaker is Shelby Kerns. She is the Executive Director at National Association of State Budget Officers in Washington, D.C. She joined NASPO in March 2020. Prior to coming to NASPO, she spent a decade in the Idaho Division of Financial Management. In her position as Budget Bureau Chief, she led staff in developing, presenting, and advocating for the governor's executive budget. The topic of her presentation today is state fiscal conditions during COVID-19. Shelby Kerns, please.
Thank you for inviting me to join you today. First, just a little bit about NASPO. For more than 75 years, the National Association of State Budget Officers has been the professional membership organization for state budget and finance officers. These are the chief financial advisors to our nation's governors. NASPO members guide their states in analysis of budget options and formation of sound public policy. And I can't help but note how happy I am to be joining you today. Years ago, I worked on international trade issues for the state of Idaho and had many opportunities to visit South Korea, including as staff on governor's trade missions. I had the most beautiful experiences, and joining you is a wonderful reminder of that time, and it also makes me anxious to return when travel has safely resumed. Next slide. The COVID-19 pandemic and the economic crisis it created have put state budgets in the news more than any time since the Great Recession. The past year has been a rocky road for states, and I'll walk you through the conditions they've faced, but I'm happy to report that states are in a much better financial position than we anticipated at this time last year. Most of the data I'm sharing today is from NASPO's recently released 2020 Fall Fiscal Survey, which collects information on states' enacted budgets. It's important to note that the data represents a point in time when a state completed the survey, and those points in time differ by state, depending on when the state enacted its budget for fiscal 2021, and also how often a state revises its revenue forecast. The budget figures in this survey were enacted as long ago as April 2019 for some states with biennial budgets, and as recently as September 2020. These points in time are always important, but conditions have changed so rapidly over the past year that timing has a more pronounced effect than normal. Next slide. As has been noted, states have various sources of revenue, but today I'm focusing on what we call the general fund. This excludes funding from the federal government, dedicated fees and taxes, such as fuels taxes directed to building and repairing transportation infrastructure, and revenue from bonds. While each state has its own revenue makeup due to its unique tax structure, in aggregate, fiscal 2020 general fund revenue was comprised of about 45% personal income tax, 30% sales tax, 6.4% corporate income tax, nearly 1% from gaming tax, and about 18% from other sources. Next slide. So as Katherine mentioned, after 9 years of consecutive growth, fiscal 2020 saw state revenues decline. Before the COVID-19 crisis hit, states were expecting general fund revenue growth of 2.9% in fiscal 2020 and 3% in fiscal 2021. Compared to those pre-COVID revenue projections, preliminary actual fiscal 2020 general fund collections declined by 3.8%, and fiscal 2021 estimates showed a decline of 10.8%. Such a steep revenue loss in just over 1 year period is very noteworthy, particularly since federal stimulus measures, including enhanced unemployment compensation, the Paycheck Protection Program, checks to individuals, and other measures were in place that helped prop up the economy and thus state revenues during much of that time. We were also very concerned because state tax collections, this was also noted by Katherine, particularly from income taxes, usually lag economic downturns. That's what we saw in the Great Recession. So with states facing these consecutive years of general fund revenue declines in fiscal 2020 and 2021, it remained uncertain how long it would take for state general fund budgets to recover. And after the Great Recession, even though revenues began to grow again in fiscal 2011, it took until fiscal 2013 for state general fund revenue to surpass its fiscal 2008 levels without adjusting for inflation. States did not see revenue fully restored to fiscal 2008 levels until fiscal 2018 in inflation-adjusted terms. And we'll talk more about fiscal 2021, which is the current fiscal year states are in, revenue projections and collections later, but I do want to note that we are currently seeing improvement from the projections at the time that this data was collected. Next slide. This shows the expenditure, so the spending side of the revenue decline states experienced. States reported that preliminary actual general fund spending for fiscal 2020 came in at $903.1 billion, a 4% annual increase. You can see that states' enacted budgets for fiscal 2021 are projected to reduce general fund spending by 1.1% compared to preliminary actual fiscal 2020 levels. That's the first time states have enacted a net spending decrease in more than a decade. Next slide. And of course, states budget on a revenue projection. And this slide compares spending to what states were expecting to spend prior to the pandemic. While actual general fund spending for fiscal 2020 did increase, it was 1.7% below the level that states expected to spend prior to the COVID-19 crisis. This really speaks to the severe rapid impacts that COVID-19 had on state budgets, given that there's typically that lag between the start of an economic downturn and the state fiscal stress that necessitates spending reductions. The pandemic and ensuing economic impacts also hit late in the fiscal year, which made it hard for states to rely too much on spending cuts to close any budget shortfalls, although they did take steps to rein in spending for the remainder of the year. Compared to governor's budget proposals for fiscal 2021, which were released in most states just a few months prior to the pandemic hitting, states' enacted budgets showed a 5.5% or $52 billion reduction in general fund spending. Next slide. And this slide shows how quickly those state revenues were impacted and that it hit many state budgets. In fiscal 2019, 0 states reported making mid-year general fund budget reductions due to a revenue shortfall. In fiscal 2020, 19 states reported needing to make general fund budget cuts mid-year. And again, those cuts came in the last months of the fiscal year due to the impact of the pandemic. Next slide. So what programs and areas were the most impacted when states made those budget cuts? This graph shows what governors recommended for fiscal 2021 in the months before the pandemic and what states enacted due to the rapid transformation of state fiscal conditions as large segments of the economy ground to a halt due to the public health measures and that revenue dropped. These numbers are compared to fiscal 2020 budgets. K-12 education saw the largest reduction, and higher education, transportation, and all other government programs saw net decreases as well. Medicaid and public assistance saw sizable increases in spending, reflecting rising caseloads and spending pressures for health and human services as a result of the economic downturn. At the time data was collected in the fall, 10 states reported approving net reductions post-enactment for fiscal 2021 due to a budget shortfall as well. Next slide. This shows the most commonly used strategies by states to manage their budgets and address the budget shortfalls. Those included spending cuts. These were both targeted program cuts and across the board percentage cuts. Personnel actions, that includes hiring freezes, which that's a very quick way to control spending. Furloughs, layoffs, and salary reductions are also included there. And also there's some one-time measures, of course, that states took, including using their rainy day funds, using other fund transfers, utilizing their prior year balances, and also deferring paying payments. Only a few states reported using revenue increases to help close gaps. Other strategies to reduce spending used by some states included reducing local aid and making Medicaid program changes. Some states also reported using federal assistance to offset eligible general fund costs related to the pandemic response and relief, which I'll touch on in a moment. Next slide. And Katherine covered this, so I'll just, we'll just take a quick look at state rainy day funds or savings account balances. I will note that one of the most important lessons that states learned from the Great Recession, I was in a budget office at that time, was that we really needed to have more money in savings to weather a downturn. So the next slide will show that before the COVID-19 crisis hit, state rainy day funds were at that all-time high after a decade of rebuilding reserves after the Great Recession. Since fiscal 2010, the median rainy day fund balance as a percentage of general fund spending had grown from 1.6% to 7.9% in fiscal 2019, with rainy day fund balances totaling $79 billion in fiscal 2019. Some states did turn to their rainy day funds to close shortfalls in fiscal 2020. We've also seen some states make use of their savings to address projected gaps in fiscal 2021 as well, either in their enacted or their revised budgets. Total rainy day fund balances as a percentage of general fund spending declined from 9.1% in fiscal 2019 to 7.9% in fiscal 2020, though the median rainy day fund balance has not yet recorded a decline. We receive a lot of questions about this, as many were expecting to see states drain their rainy day accounts to balance budgets. But generally, states like to spread their usage of savings over the length of a downturn to smooth out cuts. If you use it all at once, it simply delays the cuts. It makes them steeper in the next fiscal year. So you often see the use of savings coupled with cuts to meet revenue shortfalls. We anticipate that we may see state savings actually grow this next fiscal year, with states having better than expected revenue projections and collections, as well as the substantial federal aid that they've recently received. We may see states directing funds into savings. It's important to note, though, that the states that are adding to or replenishing their savings are not necessarily the states who used savings to close budget gaps. So while we may see savings increase in the aggregate, it doesn't mean that those states that were hit hard by the pandemic and utilized their rainy day funds aren't still facing lower savings balances. Next slide. Really, the fiscal response of the US government to the COVID-19 pandemic has been at historic levels. Next slide, go into this. So Congress has passed 6 pieces of legislation totaling almost $5.2 trillion. The first bill, the Coronavirus Preparedness and Response Supplemental Appropriations Act, was passed on March 6th of 2020, and the most recent, the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021, was passed on March 11th of 2021. Again, this level of spending is unprecedented. The legislation included funds to help respond to the public health emergency, economic support for businesses and individuals, funds to assist in the state response, housing assistance, money to help schools with reopening and addressing learning loss from the time students were out of the classroom, and more. And what does that all mean for states? One thing to note is that the economic support has greatly helped with conditions that have led to improved revenues for states. When people have money and they spend it, state tax receipts are increased. Federal aid also helped cover expenses states incurred in fighting the virus, and it did help states weather some budget shortfalls faced to declining revenues. Next slide. And this is where we look, as we've seen these numbers a little bit before, but if you look at the whole of state spending, not just general fund spending, you can see where those federal dollars go. So in fiscal 2019, so pre-pandemic, General fund expenditures accounted for nearly 41% of aggregate state spending, and federal fund expenditures accounted for nearly 31%. Next slide. So this shows that in fiscal 2020, which was only impacted by the pandemic for about 3 months, general fund expenditures decreased slightly to 39.7%, and federal fund expenditures accounted for about 32.4%. This is a small but meaningful change, and one that we expect to continue into fiscal 2021 and likely for a few more years. General fund expenditures will decrease as a share of state spending, while federal fund expenditures will likely increase. Next slide. One of the questions that I often hear is why states are not spending federal funds faster and what difficulties states have faced. So I'd like to outline a few of those for you. First, implementing new programs is very difficult and time-consuming. Earlier, I mentioned that one thing we learned from the Great Recession was that states needed to have more funding in their rainy day accounts. Another thing that we learned was that the most effective way to assist states was to channel federal aid through existing programs. That was a very big recommendation of NASBO. If you want to get money out the door and help states, you send the money through existing programs. But unfortunately, that was not the case with this aid. Many of the funds intended to help states weather the crisis were appropriated in new programs. This means states had to wait for federal guidance on those programs, and often for several iterations of that guidance. As you can imagine, it was also difficult to start new programs when state employees were suddenly working from home and also managing a pandemic and other economic fallout, such as rising unemployment claims. It was not a time when states could rush out and make new hires easily or train new employees given the sudden virtual work environment. In many states, governors could spend the federal funds without the approval of state legislatures. However, this was not the case in all states, and the state appropriation process is really quite slow. And that normally slow process was made even more slow and more difficult by the pandemic. It was difficult for legislatures to meet during the pandemic. Many did not have rules for meeting remotely, and it was simply not safe for them to convene. Next slide. And while the federal fiscal response has been massive, states were unsure for nearly a year whether they would receive direct state aid and also whether economic assistance would continue. You may recall there was a large span from April to December between bills, and those were among smaller relief bills. Next slide. So during that time, states enacted many programs aimed at providing economic stimulus and also supporting individuals and businesses, both with federal funds they've been appropriated in March of 2020, but they also took advantage of better than expected state revenue to provide stimulus with state dollars. California lawmakers focused their efforts last fall on a $500 million small business COVID-19 relief grant program, low interest loans for businesses with less access to traditional banking institutions, and temporary tax relief. They also provided more state-funded relief in February with a more comprehensive relief package, bolstered the small business program by $2.1 billion, including $50 million targeted to nonprofit cultural institutions. It also included license renewal fee waivers for certain businesses and emergency financial aid to community college students. Lastly, the state created its own $5.7 million direct stimulus payment program. It's called the Golden State Stimulus Plan for low-income Californians. Eligible residents received $600 in one-time relief. California was not the only state to provide direct aid to residents. Washington, D.C. sent payments of $1,200 to those receiving federal pandemic unemployment assistance. Colorado, the governor in an executive order in October 2020 authorized direct payments of $375 to about 435,000 residents. Anyone qualified to receive weekly unemployment benefits ranging from $25 to $500 between mid-March and October 2020 were eligible for those direct payments. And that Colorado's direct aid to individuals was part of a larger $300 million stimulus package that they passed. That package also included $57.1 million for local businesses, arts and cultural organizations, and also targeted some of that aid to minority-owned businesses. Lawmakers also included housing and utility assistance, food pantry assistance, restrictions on food delivery, tax and fee breaks for businesses, child care support, and grants to improve broadband access. Maryland provided immediate payments of $500 and $300 for families and individuals who qualified for the Earned Income Tax Credit. And they also supported small businesses with $200 million in sales tax credits based on a sliding scale. That stimulus measure was expected to impact 400,000 Marylanders and more than 55,000 small businesses. A couple more examples. The New Mexico provided a 4-month tax holiday to restaurants and a $600 rebate to low-income workers, a gross receipt tax reduction for restaurants, and $200 million from the state general fund for individual grants up to $100,000 for businesses that experienced declines in 2020. Nevada and Pennsylvania also concentrated on small business assistance. Nevada provided $50 million for small businesses that was targeted towards service-oriented businesses, with funds covering expenses related to working capital, PPE, or protective retrofitting due to the pandemic. And Pennsylvania established a hospitality industry recovery program, providing grants to bars, restaurants, hotels, and other impacted businesses. We saw other states also devote funds to housing programs. States generally have housing partners and local communities, so additional funding was provided in existing programs. Next slide. So here we are, a year after the pandemic hit. Many businesses were closed to public safety measures, and states were anticipating those historic drops in revenue. Luckily, those most catastrophic predictions from the spring and summer did not materialize. We've seen better than expected revenue collections and improved revenue projections from most states. Now, it's important to note that improved compared to those dire predictions does not necessarily translate to a positive or pre-COVID outlook, although some states are seeing revenues at those levels. We're finding that the impact of the pandemic has been incredibly uneven. On one end, you have states like my home state of Idaho that's experiencing record revenue growth. And on the other end, you have states with double-digit revenue losses. So while it looks like state revenues are holding steady, lost in that aggregate number is really the serious pain that's been experienced in some states. Also, the fact that states did not see catastrophic revenue impacts predicted last year can mask the fact that they have seen revenue shrink and expenditures increase. We also know that economic slowdowns can stress state budgets for years to come. The fact that lower wage earners have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic has benefited state revenues, but we know that there will be also greater expenditure pressures to help those families get back on their feet and get back into the workforce. The federal economic stimulus, Paycheck Protection Program, enhanced unemployment, direct checks to individuals, all of those programs has really propped up the economy over the past year. And the American Recovery Plan continues the stimulus and also provides much needed direct aid to states. We're still working through the mechanics of how some of the new programs will work and what type of spending will be allowed, but it will certainly help states weather the crisis and bolster their economy. Positive vaccine developments have given us reasons for optimism, but the challenges that lie ahead for effective vaccine distribution and related steps to continue controlling the spread of the coronavirus, particularly with new strains, are also significant. So having those federal funds to offset the uncertainty that brings to the revenue forecast is very helpful for states. They don't have to budget, make cuts to make sure that they'll be able to meet those balanced budget requirements that Katherine mentioned. One thing that we'll all be watching is how states spend the money without creating ongoing spending demands that they can't sustain when the federal funds go away. That's another lesson from the Great Recession. We have to be prepared for that sudden end to federal aid. So while the news is much brighter than what we expected a year ago, we're all still holding our breath just a little bit. Next slide. Thank you very much for having me, and I look forward to questions later, more discussion.
Okay, thank you for your presentation. Especially I like your summary, totally $5.2 trillion from federal government. I'm going to use this number definitely. Thank you. I appreciate your analysis of the state's decline in revenue. From your presentation today and other data from NASPO, I could gather that high-income earners' tax payments were relatively less affected even during the pandemic period, and the impact on the revenue could have been less severe. I'm curious if there is any difference between high and low income earners in terms of tax reductions, business support, house support, and more typically provided by US state government. And I'm also wondering if it doesn't take high administrative cost or time to distinguish the difference in income.
It doesn't create an administrative burden to distinguish between the high income and low income earners, because that's generally done through either pay stubs if you're getting unemployment, or through tax collections for many of the state programs that we're seeing provide stimulus to the lower wage workers who've been impacted. And the reason why that we're seeing from higher wage earners have generally been less impacted is that they were simply able to transition their work to home, while lower wage workers are generally more frontline workers, a lot of jobs in the hospitality industry and service industry that were impacted. And there's a higher expenditure burden on states due to that. If you're a higher wage earner, you probably have more savings that you would be able to weather the storm a little bit more. So as we're seeing lower wage earners be impacted, we're seeing them turn to public assistance, housing programs, food aid programs, medical assistance programs, and those are certainly having a large impact on state expenditures. Much of that is being covered by the federal government at this time, but we will see state impacts as well.
All right, thank you so much, Shelby. Let's move forward. Our last speaker is Deborah Carroll. She is an associate professor in the School of Public Administration at the University of Central Florida. She also serves as director of UCF's Center for Public and Nonprofit Management and editor-in-chief of the Journal of Public and Nonprofit Affairs. Her research focuses on financial management and fiscal policy issues of state and local governments, particularly related to taxation, revenue diversification, and urban economic development. The topic of her presentation is local government fiscal autonomy and post-COVID financial recovery. Deborah Carroll, thank you for your patience. Please.
Thank you. I'm very honored to be part of this esteemed panel today. I have had the distinct pleasure of visiting South Korea 3 times, and most recently I visited there in October of 2019. So coincidentally, Korea is actually the last place I traveled before the COVID-19 pandemic. Today, I'm going to speak with you about local government fiscal autonomy and the post-COVID financial recovery. Next slide, please. To anticipate the impact of COVID-19 on local governments and their impending economic recovery, it is important to understand the structure of governments in the United States and the context within which local governments operate. So in this presentation, I will review some of the most relevant elements of governing structure in the United States, including the roles and responsibilities of the different types of local governments, as well as some general challenges such governments face that might impede their economic recovery. Next slide, please. The US Constitution does not describe or make provisions for local governments, even though they are a noticeable part of our history and tradition. The American people have generally always favored local governance, as local governments efficiently provide public services demanded by citizens, advance democratic values, and encourage civic participation. Specifically, the US Constitution specifies the powers of the federal government and gives all residual powers to the states. So the states exist as an independent layer of government with full powers, including independent financial authority and residual powers. The states then determine the powers that are provided to local governments, including fiscal autonomy. We have two distinctions. One is Dillon's rule, which says that if a state law is silent about a particular local power, the presumption is that the local government lacks that power. This is opposed to home rule, in which local governments can act in all areas unless a state law specifically prohibits those actions. So while local government autonomy has generally declined for decades, local governments with home rule have more autonomy and tend to have a stronger financial position compared to Dillon's rule local governments. Next slide, please. This graph illustrates the distribution of local governments across the United States. These numbers on this slide actually come from the 2017 Census of Governments, which is the most recent and comprehensive data available. As you can see, we have more than 90,000 local governments in the United States. The two main classifications of local governments are special purpose governments and general purpose governments. Special purpose governments consist of special districts and school districts, and general purpose governments consist of the three types of counties, municipalities, and townships. Certainly, there is considerable variation in local governments in the United States, but there are also commonalities that allow us to speak generally about them. Still, it is important to keep in mind that the information I am providing here reflects generalizations that may not apply to every local government. Next slide, please. In terms of general purpose local governments, counties essentially represent the administrative arms of state governments. Their primary functions include property assessment and tax collection, voter registration, election supervision, record keeping, police protection, health and welfare, and consumer protection. In general, counties have more state-imposed mandates, less discretionary funds, and are more dependent on state funding. As I will discuss later, this very likely will hamper or impede some of their economic recovery going forward post-COVID. Municipalities are administrative divisions with corporate status and the powers to self-govern as granted by either the state constitution, another statute, or a municipal charter. Municipalities are usually located within a county, and decisions are generally made by elected representatives. Municipalities provide services for a defined incorporated area that represents a population center and includes police and fire protection, waste disposal, parks and recreation, emergency medical services, public transportation, and public works. Townships are less common and have been established to govern areas without a population concentration, and townships also use an elected board as opposed to elected representatives. In township governments, citizens use town meetings to deliberate and vote in a different method of self-governing. They generally have similar authority and responsibilities as municipalities. Next slide, please. Special purpose local governments, as I mentioned earlier, consist of special districts and school districts. Special districts are authorized by state law, generally to provide only one or a limited number of designated functions. They have sufficient administrative and fiscal autonomy to qualify as separate governments, and they are generally governed by an elected or appointed board. Some of the most common functions of special districts include water and sewer, port authorities, airports, and fire protection. In the United States, we have actually seen a significant increase in the use of special districts, as these types of special purpose governments are also sometimes used to circumvent tax and expenditure limitations imposed upon general purpose governments that are generally not imposed upon special purpose governments. I will speak more on that in a few minutes. Finally, we have school districts, which consist of independent public school systems with sufficient administration and fiscal autonomy to qualify, again, as separate governments. School districts are generally governed by a nonpartisan elected board. They operate very similar to cities in terms of accountability for service provision, and their primary responsibility is to provide elementary and secondary education. Next slide, please. This graph combines all operating spending, excluding capital projects, by all of the local governments that I just described, again for 2017, which is the most recent year of comprehensive available data. As you can see from this graph, the top three spending categories for local governments are education at 35.4%, public safety at 11.6%, and health and hospitals at 10.3%. Next slide, please. The primary sources of revenues for local governments are intergovernmental revenue from the states at 27.5%, property taxation at 26.2%, charges for service at 15.5%, utilities at 8%, and local sales taxes at 6.4%. It is important to keep in mind that intergovernmental revenue is considered an uncontrollable revenue source for local governments, even though it comprises the largest revenue source, because local governments generally have little control over funding received by the states and federal government, and because intergovernmental revenue tends to decline during fiscal crises, such as the one we are in because of COVID-19, as these higher level governments, the states and the federal government, also struggle financially, as my colleagues on this panel have already explained. The property tax is the only tax that's levied in all 50 states and the District of Columbia. Property taxes are generally imposed upon real property on an ad valorem basis, meaning the tax burden for property owners is based upon the fair market value of the property. Since real property generally appreciates in value over time, property tax revenue is the most stable source for local governments, which is why they are so heavily dependent upon it. In addition, real property is immobile, which is an important part of the tax base for local governments because there's little that property owners can do to minimize their tax liability, which makes the property tax less distortionary from an economic standpoint than other sources of revenue for local governments. Next slide, please. Some of the broad challenges for local governments will very likely affect their economic recovery going forward after COVID. We've already heard a little bit about balanced budget requirements. So unlike the federal government, local governments are generally not allowed to run budgetary deficits. In fact, all states except for one have these balanced budget requirements in some form. In terms of tax-based mobility, at the local level, individuals will move to communities in which the local government best satisfies their preferences related to both taxation and public service provision. This significantly affects local governments' abilities to raise revenue, as they must impose taxes on immobile bases, like the property tax, and attempt to export their tax burdens to non-residents, such as through local option sales taxes that individuals pay on purchases within a taxing jurisdiction, regardless of whether they reside in that jurisdiction. Tax elasticity refers to the degree to which tax revenue changes in response to changing economic conditions. Some taxes, like the property tax, are relatively stable, but produce a lower yield, while other taxes, like sales taxes, are more volatile, but produce greater yield during good economic times. So the goal is to diversify the local government's revenue structure such that the mix of revenue sources will produce both the necessary yield and stability to help insulate the government from economic downturns. In terms of tax and expenditure limitations, nearly all states impose some form of tax and expenditure limitation on local governments, which generally restricts growth in either taxes levied, expenditures, or both. This makes it difficult for local governments to raise sufficient revenue to finance services demanded by residents and threatens their fiscal health. At the same time, and particularly related to COVID-19, we have seen some state governments preempt their local governments by overriding local ordinances related to mask wearing, large gatherings, and other efforts to combat the virus. Finally, it is important to keep in mind that local government fiscal autonomy, as I mentioned earlier, has been declining for decades. And this will also very likely impact their post-COVID financial recovery. However, local governments, much like the states, as we've already heard, actually entered the pandemic in a relatively strong financial position. Many had general budget surpluses and rainy day funds, with some exceptions, such as cities in the Midwest and in counties, which had still been struggling since the Great Recession we heard about earlier. So going forward, it's quite likely that federal assistance will still be necessary to avoid cutting essential services in the years ahead. Next slide, please. Although the foreseeable future seems a bit bleak right now, in terms of post-COVID economic recovery, we do actually see some hopeful trends. In addition, we also see some differences between the current economic crisis and that of the Great Recession in 2007 and 2008, even at the local government level. Going forward, recent estimates, as early as I think about a month ago, anticipate state and local government revenues to decline roughly 5.6% in both 2020 and this current year, 2021. The declines that we're seeing in sales taxes at the local level and fees for services are actually larger than past experience, larger than the Great Recession in some ways. Much of this is because we've seen a sharp decline in consumption by individuals which reduces sales tax revenues. In addition, the stay-at-home orders affect transportation-related taxes and fees on items like hotels, tolls, airports, and public works that are often important revenue sources for local governments. Thus far, federal aid actually has exceeded the projected revenue losses for local governments. However, it is important to keep in mind that this aid is not recurring. We do expect at the local level to see revenue shortfalls for several years going forward. There may be a need to cut spending to prepare for future deficits, while also needing to increase spending on public health. Adequate funding of local governments is absolutely essential for a robust economic recovery. Cities are essentially cutting spending on services. They have laid off or furloughed employees, and they have postponed capital projects. Next slide, please. This graph is showing you by each state the percentage change in state tax revenues between fiscal year 2019 and 2020. And as we can see, there is a lot of red on this graph. And so we are seeing a lot of negative in terms of revenue changes over this time period. Certainly, however, there is a lot of variation across the states, and we do see some states actually see revenue growth, similar to how we experienced the Great Recession. Next slide, please. In terms of COVID-19 and sales tax revenue, the pandemic trends in consumer spending largely affect sales tax revenues. We've seen a sharp decline in services, again, as individuals have stayed home. However, services are less likely to be taxed at the local government level. We have also seen large increases in food purchases from grocery stores, which is typically taxed also at a lower rate or not at all. Finally, we've seen steep declines in spending at restaurants and hotels, which are typically taxed at a higher rate. Whether these trends actually reduce or simply delay consumer spending is still unknown, and only time will reveal this going forward. Next slide, please. In terms of COVID-19 and property tax revenue, this is perhaps the biggest difference between the Great Recession, which was the result of the housing crisis, and our current economic crisis due to COVID. Within this economic crisis related to COVID, we've actually seen housing prices hold steady or actually increase. So we don't actually expect to see much in terms of future declines in property tax revenues. We do not expect those declines to be significant. Next slide, please. Very importantly, there has been some federal assistance with economic recovery. As mentioned in the previous presentation, the CARES Act funding of $200 billion was made available to state and local governments, and this included federal aid for public transit, K-12 education, public colleges and universities, and healthcare providers. Most recently, the American Rescue Plan Act provided $130 billion in direct aid to local governments. These funds may be used to cover revenue shortfalls, increase spending to mitigate the economic harm from the pandemic, to provide premium pay for essential workers, to transfer funds to nonprofit groups, and to invest in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. The Families First Coronavirus Response Act increased the federal share of Medicaid spending through the pandemic, which has alleviated some of the burden of state and local governments as well. In addition, the Federal Reserve has established the Municipal Liquidity Facility to ease cash flow pressures by purchasing short-term municipal debt. In addition, we are seeing interest rates at historic low rates. And so local governments are able to borrow without having to incur significant costs to repay that debt. Thus far, federal aid seems adequate to offset the revenue losses this year, but the future most certainly remains uncertain. There's significant variation among the states, as some will still face budget shortfalls even without large increases in COVID-related spending. Next slide, please. Thank you, and I look forward to continuing this discussion further.
Deborah, Carroll, thank you for your presentation. I appreciate that you explained the US federal, state, and local government system in an easy way. And also I'm surprised that there are more than 90,000 local governments in the US. Wow, I didn't expect that kind of big number. You mentioned that housing prices have held steady or increased, so future declines in property tax revenues are not expected to be significant. From the local government point of view, it is fortunate that housing prices are rising or stable. Meanwhile, some argue that there is a possibility of housing bubble. Institutional investors are joining the housing demand recently, and the interest rate on the 3-year mortgage loan are rising. It is not likely, but if problems occur in the housing market, it will impact the local government's revenue. What's your opinion on this issue, Professor?
Yes, well, this is a topic that I'm personally familiar with because I live in Orlando, Florida, which is an area that has experienced very rapid growth in housing prices and in rental costs. And investors are becoming increasingly aggressive about trying to purchase property, to the extent that I have received telephone calls randomly out of the blue from investors asking if I would like to sell my house. So certainly, I do believe that there is a housing bubble that is being created by investors, which potentially could be bad for local governments. In the Great Recession, we experienced that housing bubble burst. And since that time, to hopefully avoid that happening again, a number of safeguards have been put in place since that time. However, the current housing bubble that we are seeing, I think the largest problem that presents currently is that we're starting to face an affordable housing crisis in the United States. As I mentioned in my presentation, individuals are mobile and they can choose communities that best meet their preferences for taxing and spending. And so as demographics shift due to this consumer mobility, local governments certainly will struggle. And this definitely becomes exacerbated by tax and expenditure limitations that are placed upon local governments. The final point that I would like to make is that it's important to keep in mind that because of the diversity of the United States, not all areas are seeing tremendous growth in rental costs or housing prices. It is an uneven distribution of growth. And so it certainly puts some communities at an advantage and others at a disadvantage. But overall, we are facing significantly, and in some particular cities, a significant shortfall of affordable housing.
All right, thank you. Okay, that's all speakers we have today. Now it's open discussion session. Let's invite two special panelists from Korea now. The first panelist is Kwan-Gyu Park. He is Director of Policy Research Office of the Governors Association of Korea. And he has spent over 20 years on decentralization policy in Korea. He holds a PhD in public administration. And the second panelist is Kyu-Chul Gu. He is professor of economics at Gyeonggi University and advisor of Governors Association of Korea. He used to be a researcher at Korea Development Institute. He received PhD in economics from University of Missouri in Kansas City. All right, I can see all of you. Good, thank you. Before jumping into the discussion with all speakers, I'd like to ask our speakers for some comments on other presentation. We want to get a further understanding of today's topics. I know this is not a presidential debate, but because of the time limit, I will give you 2 minutes each. Katherine, Willoughby, please.
Okay, well, wonderful presentations, and I'm intrigued because all of our work, and we didn't meet ahead of time to get together on this, but our work converges. We all are coming up with similar lessons learned and trends happening. I think what I find interesting about both my colleagues' work is that they represent the tremendous diversity in the United States among governments. I mean, in Atlanta, for instance, to drive from, you know, the tip of Fulton County, which encompasses Atlanta. Atlanta's smack in the middle of Fulton County, which is a long, thin county. You probably can go through, you know, if you're driving a car, you might go through 50 police departments where you could get a ticket from 50 different entities. So I think that speaks to the unique quality of the United States, that each one of these layers of government has its own tax structure, and you know, there are components of those structures and those capacities that impact how they're able to operate, and that governments can navigate through, state governments and local governments in the United States can navigate through, is even more impressive when you understand this tremendous intergovernmental puzzle that is the United States. So I appreciate my colleagues highlighting that in their presentations.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Shelby Kerns, you are muted now.
By the time I figure that out, we'll have stopped doing Zoom meetings. I really enjoyed my colleagues' presentations. I feel like I've learned quite a bit today. One thing that stood out to me is how I always say that we're always trying to solve the last problem, and we're very focused on what has come before. And so we've really pinned our projections and our response to the Great Recession. And I think it's been really highlighted how different this crisis was. And one of the things that stood out to me is how that's been in some ways beneficial to states who did not see quite the long-term impact, or so it seems right now, but that there was a different impact on local governments due to their tax structures and the changing spending patterns that we've had during the pandemic, where those local services are really taxed at that local level. And that's an interesting piece that I think we have to keep in mind as we continue to sort of combat this economic crisis. It's not the same, and we need to find those small local governments and businesses that were really hit.
Thank you. Deborah, Katherine, please.
Yes, so I would also like to reiterate how well all three of these presentations fit together to really deliver, I think, a very comprehensive and holistic view of state and local government finance and economic recovery from COVID. And what I found interesting is that I think the presentations really highlighted the interconnectedness between all of these different layers of governments and how the fiscal health of states impacts that of their local governments and vice versa. And I also agree that we like to look back at history because it tends to repeat itself, but we like to learn from it. And so I think it's been really fascinating to see, for both the state level and the local level, the similarities and differences from the Great Recession to now. So I do really feel as if all three of these presentations are creating a nice broad picture of the case and the situation here in the United States.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much for your comments. Now, finally, let's hear some comments and questions from our panelists in Korea. Please specify to whom you are asking a question. Kwan Gyu-bak, are you ready? Please, you have 7 minutes.
Thank you. My name is Kwan Park. As Moderator An introduced me, I'm so happy to participate in this webinar because, and I have one thing to thank COVID-19 because we can have this webinar through Zoom now here. And I have also I also have very insight and lessons from 3 professionals from USA, and I was very happy. So I am 3 of you, all of 3 mentioned in common the rainy fund, the importance of rainy day fund. It was very helpful, I guess. So, and especially Katherine explained COVID-19 has made more worst case scenario or a negative impact on economy and our everyday life in the world than the Great Recession in the 2008 and 9, and in the area of this unemployment, tax revenues, real GDP, etc. Especially in the presentation of Katherine, she mentioned that the distinctiveness of COVID-19 situation that was that U.S. federal government made aid immediately to state and local government as well as the business and individuals in the state. Then the Great Recession period. That was very interesting and interested in. And secondly, I would like to mention the Shelby's presentation. In general, Shelby explained that the tax-centered revenue in the U.S. It was a little bit different from Korean because in Korea, the provinces and local government deeply depend on national or central government transfers rather than tax revenues. Nonetheless, Korean government and Korean local and province government have oriented to have more tax revenues than national transfers, which was trying to have or increase the net tax autonomy or fiscal autonomy and authorities to Korean provinces and local governments, and then the second one by the Shelby's presentation, the federal responses to COVID-19, it was very I think very big than Korean, which was made actually, I think that based upon the Shelby's presentation, U.S. federal government has made 6 times aid to U.S. states and local government and individuals and businesses. It was almost more $5 trillion. And then especially the federal government directly gave state and local government is more than almost $5,000 billion. I expect that kind of measures happen in Korea too. And then finally, I want to mention that Deborah's presentation that was very helpful to understand U.S. federal system and state and local government functions and powers in terms of revenue changes and federal aid to federal aid is necessity, etc. It was very useful and helpful for us too. And then this kind of your insightness and helpness, I want to give 2 questions to Katherine and Deborah. First question to Katherine was that on the rainy day fund, the rainy fund very was helpful then in this time, COVID-19 pandemic, than the Great Recession, as based upon your presentations. So my question is here, how much degree states have spent that rainy day fund? And then how much degree the rainy day fund is helpful to recover COVID-19 pandemic negative impact? That is for my first question. And the second one to Deborah is that this question comes from your presentation on the percentage change in the state and local government tax revenues. So in that graph, the 10 states, as you mentioned that of the presentation, 10 states such as Idaho, North Dakota, Utah, etc., has tax revenue increase rather than but the other 40 states decrease. My question is that why is it possible? Why and how is it possible that it is unusual that kind of tax revenue increase? I guess so. If possible, please tell us that a few regions or mechanisms to that kind of tax increase happening. Thank you so much for listening my bad discussions or askings. Thank you.
Sure. So you were asking about rainy day funds and how much states had to spend to support their efforts during COVID or the Great Recession, how much they spend, how much they have left. Most states have caps on their rainy day funds. Some states have a few of these types of funds. They might have more than one or two even. And states have requirements for paying into these funds. too, and they also have requirements related to when they can use these funds. So it's, you know, when, again, like everything with the states, it's hard to make an overarching statement about this much came from the rainy day funds, because as Shelby noted, some states didn't use their rainy day fund in the current disaster. Some states don't touch it. You know, some states in the Great Recession didn't touch their rainy day fund. So it's gonna, again, it gets back to those laws and statutes related to these funds, how much you have to have in it, where revenues, what revenues you can put into that fund, whether they come from tax revenues or transfers or other things, what you can spend out of those funds, is something else. The use of those funds, what the funds are going to be used for. So I will say, and Shelby noted this, that states generally don't like to use, you know, drain their rainy day funds, and especially not immediately. It's always a great thing for a governor to be leaving office and saying, I, you know, plumped up the rainy day fund, I didn't drain it. So it's a little hard to say. Certainly over the period of the Great Recession, more states access their rainy day funds than have accessed them so far for 2020 and 2021. But nonetheless, yeah, there are a lot of rules and laws that dictate when those funds can be used. So they can be kind of a helpful, quick fix to a certain extent for states. There's also a really lengthy literature that talks about the fact that, you know, do you want to have 5% available of your expenditures, or, you know, what does it take for you to have a robust, wonderful rainy day fund that it serves as a real cushion? And academics and practitioners haven't really decided on that amount, but they certainly agree that you should have something. And again, like much of state finance, I think is important, is the symbolism that rainy day fund offers, that we are preparing for a downturn. We're preparing for a disaster. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Kwan Kyu Park. And our next panelist is Richard Gu. Please, you have 7 minutes.
Well, first, thank you for joining me to this very timely and important panel discussion in the COVID-19 period. I'd like to compare and contrast the situation in Korea and United States. That will be my job for the audience here in Korea. So I will make a statement in our presentation order. First, Katherine, our first presenter, said that the demand for state service increased with COVID-19, and unemployment fund rapidly depleted as job losses exploited. That situation is the same as in here, Korea. So local government expenditure has been expanding, and also the revenue has been decreasing. So that is the same situation for all over the world. So, but she also mentioned that the taxes are the largest source of state revenues. But in Korea's current situation is quite different. Among the 226 local governments in Korea, 1 in 3 local governments could not afford to pay the local public servants payroll cost with their own tax revenues. So consequently, intergovernmental transfers appear to have been the main policy instrument in Korea. But the critical question is, therefore, how and to what extent the current balance between taxes and grants. So it means that decentralization is more asymmetric than a decade ago, and also the gap between subnational government expenditure and subnational government-owned tax revenue has widened. And the share of intergovernmental grant in the total government expenditure covering this gap has become larger. In short, the central government's revenue and expenditure responsibility have been increasing, whereas the local governments have been decreasing. Okay, that is the quite different situation for here. The second comment, my comment for Katherine's presentation, is that Katherine mentioned that the governments point out that the recession, before the recession, there were concerns about the adequacy of state fiscal capacity in the face of increasing policy responsibility, as well as warnings about states' long-term challenges. Okay. That statement applies to Korea's situation well. In Korea, local social welfare expenditure has increased rapidly in recent years. So that increasing welfare expenditure causes fiscal pressure for the local government. For example, the growth rate of total expenditure for the central government is 5%, and the social welfare expenditure is 7% for the last decade, whereas the growth rate of local expenditure is 4 point, and the growth rate of local social welfare expenditure is 10% point. That means the pressure from social welfare expenditure will go to local government more than the central government. Actually, Katherine mentioned this situation too. So, in the and also the 2020 State addresses, Katherine said that there is many need for maintaining fiscal responsibility by erasing deficit, paying down debt, and limiting future spending. Okay, that would be much tough situation for local government in the United States as well as in Korea. Okay, that is my comment for our first presenter, Katherine. And so I will turn to our second presentation. Shelby mentioned that the income tax would decline to follow the pandemic because the pandemic induced economic downturn. That's quite the same for Korea. But in Korea, the tax structure is quite different from the United States. As the other presenter explained, Korea has two-tiered subnational governments, upper-tiered and lower-tiered. Okay, so the local taxes are levied by metropolitan city and those of provinces. So the structure of local government, local tax system are different for metropolitan area and provincial area. So in the provincial area, we have local corporate income tax and local personal income tax, but the tax goes to lower tier local government, such as city, county, and special districts, something like that. So that causes these local government to have much more fluctuation in the tax revenue in terms of the income taxes. So, for example, local income taxes account for 20%, about 20% of total local tax revenues, and the local tax revenue in Suwon-si and Pohang-si are largely affected by the management performance of a certain large enterprise, such as Samsung and POSCO. So these local governments experienced a very, very large fluctuation in terms of the tax revenue. So that is the current, that added to revenue situation here. Okay, that is the, okay, I have, how many minutes do I have now? Okay, so I will do it quickly. Okay, the second comment for Shelby is that the Shelby also specified the federal COVID-19 response bills. Okay, so we have 4 or 5 COVID-19 response bills. So I was wondering whether these funds are matching or conditional fund, or do you think it is a kind of unfunded mandate? Well, that is my question for Shelby. Okay, let's go to the third papers, which presented by Deborah. Okay, Deborah showed us the structure of tax of local government in the United States. Especially, I'm interested in the special district. So I wondered why U.S. government have utilized this special district for tax or specific expenditure. For example, the other day I read an article which explained a special district for mosquito. So in some county, they have a mosquito tax, right, to deal with the mosquito things. So yeah, that is quite important for tax autonomy. So tax autonomy means there will be more local government responsibility and accountability. Okay, so I was very wondering this kind of the special district for tax revenue. And also, that will be my last comment. Okay, that also Deborah mentioned that housing prices have had steady, so future decline in property tax revenues not expected to be significant. But I very concerned about the recovery shape. In other words, some experts expect that the recovery will be K-shaped. That means some parts of the economy will recover quickly, whereas the other part will be very slow to recover. In this situation, if the property tax will increase, then I'm very concerned about the tax resistance. So, do you think we have a kind of tax circuit breaker for the self-employed person or needed person, something like that? So that's my question for our Deborah. Okay, that's it. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, any speaker can answer those questions.
I can chime in on that last question. You're absolutely right. There have been some predictions that the economic recovery will be K-shaped, and so some sectors will recover much more quickly than others. So in terms of the housing market and property tax revenues, certainly we don't expect to see a significant decline in those, and for local governments that's very good news because they are so heavily dependent on that as a way to finance essential public services. I think the part of the economy that may not recover quite as quickly, that will affect local governments in particular, I think people are going to get back to traveling a little bit more slowly than would be necessary for that quick recovery. And there are a lot of places like where I live in the state of Florida, we rely very heavily on tourism. Now, our state didn't shut down quite as rigidly or for as long as a lot of other states. And so Florida is actually not doing terrible financially, but I think those areas of the country that rely on tourism, I think might be a little bit slower to start to realize some of those sales tax revenues and accommodations tax and lodging taxes and those that are related to the transportation-based or tourism-based taxes. I expect those to come about a little bit more slowly.
Thank you, Deborah, Carroll. Is there anybody who wants to add something?
Yeah, I can answer the question about the money in the federal response and whether those are matching funds or targeted. And the funds in those bills encompass all of the support that the federal government appropriated in response to the pandemic. So that includes checks to individuals to help with economic support, the Paycheck Protection Program, loans, all of the funds that were needed to provide both economic support and support for the pandemic itself. So public health funding. So the money that's gone to states and local governments, some is matching funds, some come with strings. They've gone into very many different pots. So it's really hard to make a general statement about those funds because it's such an all-encompassing number. I didn't parse it out into various pots.
All right. Thank you, Future Gu, and your answers. All right. Unfortunately, is there anybody who adds something? Finally, nobody. Okay, it's already 10 and 12. It's time to go to bed. All right. Unfortunately, that's all the time we've got for today. I appreciate your cooperation and participation. Thank you all.
Thank you.
I believe today's webinar is particularly critical for the future. Experts, policy analysts, budget officers get to know what lessons were learned from the case of US and how they can utilize those lessons for the future. I hope this webinar was helpful to inspire Korean local government officials to develop a financial decentralization strategy by understanding the financial structure and cooperation of the US federal, state, and local governments. The American branch of Governors Association of Korea in New York will prepare another webinar with interesting topics. See you soon. Bye-bye. All right.
이러지